The first enslaved people arrived in New York in 1626. Slavery continued to be legal in New York until 1827. At the turn of the 18th century, New York City had the second highest concentration of people in bondage after Charleston, South Carolina. Many prominent New York families were slaveholders, including the Jay family. The Jays have a long, complicated history with slavery. Earlier generations were lifelong enslavers, never questioning the institution. John Jay is recorded as having conflicting views on slavery his entire life. He would publicly denounce slavery and make attempts to end the practice, all while being a slaveholder himself. Later generations were abolitionists. They used their education and position of prominence to help both enslaved and free Black individuals have access to justice. This video is going to take a closer look at the Jay family and the evolution of their views on slavery. The first Jay to set foot in New York was Augustus Jay, John Jay's paternal grandfather. Augustus was a French Huguenot who fled France because of religious persecution. Augustus arrived in New York in 1686 and was soon employed by Frederick Phillips. Phillips was known to be heavily involved in the slave trade, and records indicate that while working for Phillips, Augustus made several trips to Africa and oversaw the trading of furniture, spices, and enslaved people. Later in life, Augustus became a prominent merchant and invested his own capital in the slave trade. He was an investor in 11 different slave ships that carried a total of 108 slaves to the port of New York between 1717 and 1732. No record exists about Augustus's own slave ownership. Peter Jay was born in 1704 and followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a successful merchant. Like his father, Peter also invested in slave ships. He invested in 7 ships that delivered a total of 46 slaves to the port of New York between 1730 and 1733. Peter was an enslaver for the entirety of his adult life. In 1764, he had a young enslaved girl named Mercy inoculated against smallpox. While the act of inoculating Mercy may seem benevolent, the motivation was most likely for Peter to protect his investment. The effects of smallpox could be lifelong, leaving Peter responsible to care for her. Upon his death in 1782, Peter willed most of his enslaved people to his sons, but did include a specific clause pertaining to 2 of them. He wrote, "And my 2 Negro women, Zilpha and Mary, in consideration of long service, are to have their choice of masters among my sons." In a letter to an abolition society in England in 1788, Jay wrote, "The great majority, or rather the great body, of our people had been so long accustomed to the practice and convenience of having slaves." Jay owned a number of slaves throughout his life. He both inherited and bought slaves, some of which are written about in family correspondence. 2 women Jay enslaved that we know a great deal about are Clorinda and Zilpha. Clorinda had been enslaved by John's father, Peter, but was later purchased by John Jay. Zilpha, Clorinda's daughter, grew up in the Jay house. However, in 1809, after being deemed what Jay called difficult, she was sold to John's sister-in-law. Jay rented her back in 1811 and then purchased her again in 1813. He wrote, "On the first we took her into our service pay, therefore to Mrs. Watkins on the first day of every month while we continue to employ Zilpha, the wages agreed upon, $3 per month. Prior to 1810, Clorinda was manumitted. Upon his death in 1829, John Jay included a provision in his will that Clorinda was to be cared for by his son William for the remainder of her life. Clorinda remained with the Jay family until her death in 1837. Zilpha was manumitted in 1817, but stayed in the Jay household as a paid employee. She died in 1872 and was buried with William Jay's family at St. Matthew's Church in Bedford. John Jay had a long conflicting relationship with slavery. In 1785, he founded and was first president of the Society for Promoting the Manumission of Slaves. The society advocated for manumission of the enslaved and putting laws on the books to protect them and free Black people. Many members of the society were enslavers when they joined, and some continued to be enslavers throughout their tenure, Jay being one of them. While governor, John Jay signed into law an act for the gradual abolition of slavery in New York. The law was later turned into a complete abolition law, and slavery became illegal in New York in 1827. It is important to note that while Jay worked to end slavery in New York, he continued to be a slaveholder. He didn't manumit his last slave until 1817. When John and Sarah Jay departed for Europe in 1779 on a diplomatic mission, they were accompanied by an enslaved woman named Abby. Abby had been owned by Sarah for several years and came along as her personal servant. Once the Jays were in Paris in 1782, they hired staff to run their household. Abby disliked the way that she was being treated by one of the staff members and decided to run away when she was offered paid work from a washerwoman. John was in England at the time and looked to his friend and colleague, Benjamin Franklin, who was in France, to handle the situation. At Franklin's suggestion, Jay had Abby arrested and incarcerated. Despite frequent requests from the Jays for her return to their home, Abby refused. Jay was perplexed as to why Abby would run away in the first place. He wrote, "It was a measure of which I cannot conceive of a motive. I had promised to manumit her upon our return to America, provided she behaved properly in the meantime." Only after Abby became ill while in jail did she agree to return to the Jay home. She died from her illness in December 1783. Abby was not the first enslaved person to run away from John Jay. An enslaved man named Massey ran away and joined the British forces in 1778. Enslaved men were promised their freedom by the British if they left their American enslavers and served in the British Army during the Revolutionary War. Massey served in the Wagon Master General's Department. Massey survived the war and is recorded in the Book of Negroes as heading to Port Mattoon, Nova Scotia, in November 1783. He was 22 years old. John's younger son William inherited the property after his father's death in 1829. William was a lawyer by trade, but he is known for his dedication to the abolitionist cause. William was a moral abolitionist. Moral abolitionism was rooted in the belief that the ending of slavery would come through the voluntary manumission of the enslaved by their enslavers who had been convinced that slavery was a sin. By the early 1850s, William was no longer in the forefront of the anti-slavery movement. Most abolitionists had decided that political action was the fastest way to end slavery. Some even advocated violent acts, and others the dissolution of the Union. William opposed these methods, although he did advocate peacefully resisting what he considered to be the unconstitutional Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. After his death in 1858, William was eulogized by Frederick Douglass. Peter Augustus, John's eldest son, served as both president of the New York Manumission Society and president of the New York Public School Society, which was anti-slavery and concerned with greater humanitarianism towards the poor. In 1821, he gave a speech at the New York State Constitutional Convention as a delegate, arguing that the right to vote should be extended to free African Americans. The motion was overruled. John's two daughters, Maria and Nancy, were founders of the Society for the Support of the Colored Home in 1839. The first meeting was held at Maria's home in New York City, and Nancy was the first contributor, giving a $1,000 donation. They both continued to fund organizations that supported free Black people. Upon her death, Nancy left most of her estate to charities that supported the former enslaved and women. Future generations of Jays continued to be dedicated to abolition and to social justice. John Jay's grandson, John Jay II, became a prominent lawyer who dedicated much of his career to the anti-slavery cause. While attending Columbia University in 1834, at the age of 17, he became the manager of the New York Young Men's Anti-Slavery Society. During the 1840s and 1850s, he was one of the most active and influential attorneys working in support of anti-slavery efforts. He won many important court cases on behalf of fugitive slaves who had made their way to New York. In the late 1850s and 1860s, he continued to be an advocate for anti-slavery and other progressive causes. His son, William J. II, served as a colonel in the American Civil War, joining the fight to end slavery on a national scale.